Thanks very much. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Pearson Edexcel Summer 2021 update for Edexcel GCSE and A-Level History teachers. My name's Mark Batty. I'm the History Subject Advisor. I'm going to be going through the slides today and trying to answer your questions. We've also got in the background answering questions Mark Anstey, who's the Product Manager for History and Politics Qualifications, and Sarah Bashford, who is the Senior Curriculum Manager for History Qualifications. So hopefully you've met us before, you've come across us in emails and things like that. So we've got a lot of people on today's event, and I'm sure you've all got loads of questions you want to ask. If I can ask you to please try and keep your questions related to the sort of materials on screen as we go through it. Obviously, there's a Q&A box. You can send specific questions in to Mark and Sarah, and they'll try and answer your questions. There is a group chat box as well. That's a different box from the question and answer box. You can use that to communicate with each other. I mean, I'll try and answer questions that go through, but as I said, we have got a lot to get through and there's a lot of people here today. So if we don't manage to get to answering your question, please feel free to email me at teachinghistory@pearson.com and I'll be able to help you that way as well. Okay, so in terms of today's agenda, we're going to go through some of the key dates and deadlines involved in the process, and then we've got just a general overview of the grading process. We'll look at the support that we've got on offer to help you with that grading. And then finally, there's quite a detailed section of history-specific FAQs. Basically, I've been inundated with emails from teachers asking all sorts of questions about the evidence and the grading process and things like that. So I've tried to cover as many of those questions as possible in these FAQs. So hopefully, if you've got general questions like which grade boundaries do I use and things like that, please can you just try and wait till that section, because hopefully it will be covered by that. If not, obviously we'll try and hang around at the end to answer some of your questions as well. Okay, so we're going to start just by giving you a brief overview of this process that we're going through this year. So obviously, students will receive grades awarded and determined by teachers, and pupils will only be assessed on what they've been taught. So this year there'll be no algorithm in place like what happened last year, and teachers this year need to take an evidence-based approach, and that can draw on a range of evidence. For example, it could be using optional questions provided by exam boards, mock exams, coursework for things like A-level history, and other work completed as part of the student's course, such as in-class assessments or potentially substantial homework, provided that you can verify that it was the student's own work. Now, I'm sure you're aware the exam boards have provided lots of guidance for teachers on the website, so we'll be going through some of that today. And then obviously the date for you to submit the grades to us is the 18th of June. And then the results days are earlier as well this year. So A-level is on the 10th of August and GCSE is on the 12th of August. So a quick overview of some of the important dates that are involved in this process. So on the 26th of March, the Joint Council published some grade descriptors on their website. Hopefully you've all had a chance to look at those. They are the same for all awarding bodies in a particular subject. So for GCSE history, they're the same across the different awarding bodies, if that makes sense. On the 31st of March, we released additional assessment materials. So these are packs of questions and mark schemes under padlock, and they only come from past papers, and we'll discuss the reasons for that a bit later on. On the 19th of April, we released some grading exemplification. You can find that on our website. We also released lots of general support on our Pearson Professional Development Academy, and I'll show you a bit more about that later as well. Very recently, yesterday, in fact, was the entry deadline for private candidates. And then there's a really important deadline for centres coming up at the end of this week, and that's the 30th of April, which is the deadline for the submission of the quality assurance policy. And there's a proforma for that on the Joint Council's website. The window for submitting teacher assessed grades will be between the 26th of May and the 18th of June. And then, as we've discussed, the results days are a bit earlier this year. And there's a link to the key dates available on our website on this presentation. You should be able to use that once you download a copy of the presentation. Okay, so we're now going to look at some of the guidance that's coming out from the Joint Council or the JCQ. Now, most of the sort of guidance for this process is actually coming from them through their website, and that's because they need to ensure that there's a consistent approach being applied across the different awarding bodies. So on the 26th of March, the Joint Council produced a very detailed guidance document called Guidance on Determining Grades, and there's a link to it in the presentation. Now, this is the main reference guide that UK centres need to follow when arriving at grades for students this summer. It's a really detailed guidance document. There's a lot of information in it, and we really do recommend that you download it and read it. As well as that guidance document, there are lots of other useful guidance documents and checklists and things like that on the Joint Council website. So it's really worth having a look at that. Some examples include an assessment record sheet, which you can download and edit and use that to record your marks and grades for your students. There's a head of department checklist, and there's the grade descriptors, which we talked about a bit earlier. Now, obviously, we've got a link to that document as well on our website, and we've also produced like a summary of the top 10 important things to note from that document as well. And again, there's a link to that on these slides. Now, the next set of slides, what we're going to do is just summarize some of the key details from this guidance document as we go through the process. So the first thing we're going to focus on is this quality assurance process. Now, this diagram's a bit complicated, but essentially it summarizes that process. Now, if you look at the bottom of the diagram, you can see that it's kind of broken up into 3 key stages. Now, the first key stage is the completion of the centre policy and the summary, which needs to be submitted through the portal by the 30th of April, which is the end of this week. Now, once centres have submitted those policies, the exam boards will then check the policies. And the way it's been divided up is each exam board is going to take a certain group of centres according to the centre number, and there are details of that on the Joint Council's website. So we then move into stage 2 of the quality assurance process, where exam boards will be contacting centres and carrying out virtual centre visits to discuss the policies if we feel that you need further support and guidance based on what's been submitted. After that, you'll then be submitting your teacher assessed grades from May up till the 18th of June. And then we move into stage 3 of the quality assurance process. Now, there's not a lot of information on this slide because when it was written, we didn't really know much. Now, last week, a little bit more information was released by Ofqual, and it's available to read on their website. There's an Ofqual blog about it. So what we know now is that every centre will be asked to provide samples of student work. For A-level centres, it will be 1 A-level subject of at least 5 students. And for GCSE centres, it will be 2 GCSE subjects of at least 5 students, and one of those subjects is likely to be maths or English. Now, there may be a requirement to submit more evidence, and I think that might come as part of a targeted or random sampling approach based on stage 2 of the quality assurance process. So if it's felt that there may have been further guidance needed or support, that might feed through into that. So once you've submitted your samples, exam boards, we'll actually tell you which students we want, basically, in which subjects. And that will happen the week beginning the 21st of June. And you'll have 48 hours to submit the evidence. And then if we've got concerns about any of that, we might ask for more evidence, and we might ask you to reconsider the grades. So that's a sort of summary of the quality assurance process. I'm sure that there'll be lots more information coming out soon about stage 3 of the process in particular. Just want to have a quick focus on this centre policy then. There's a lot of information that's on the Joint Council website. There's like a template that centres fill in, and this is filled in by the senior leadership team for a centre. So every centre must produce a centre policy. And as I said, there's a pre-populated template on the JCQ website. And it gets submitted through a portal. And depending on your centre number, you would submit it to either Pearson through Edexcel Online or AQA or OCR. And this policy provides a summary of your approach to assessment and quality assurance. For every centre, the head is required to complete a summary as well, which gets submitted alongside that policy. And the deadline for that is the end of the week. Now, as history teachers, it's really important that you make sure that your approach to grading and evidence is in line with your own centre's policy. So I'm getting questions from teachers saying things like, how many bits of evidence can I use, this and that? Like, it's really important that you check what, with your SLT on what's expected in terms of the approach and the policy. Because, when we get a bit later and we start looking at the appeals process, as part of that appeals process, we will be checking to make sure that you followed the processes outlined in your policy. Obviously, there's lots of guidance on grading in that document as well. The important thing to note is that you're going to be assessing students only on what they've been taught, and that you need to make sure that students have the opportunity to show the full breadth of their knowledge and understanding in each subject, obviously based on what they've been taught. It's important that grades represent a holistic, objective judgment based on evidence. Now, that evidence can be of different types. It could be a substantial piece of homework if you can be sure that it's the student's own work. It could be an in-class assessment. It could be a past paper. It could be your own paper. It could be a formal mock, an invigilated exam. It's up to you what evidence you use. And it can come from across the course of study. So it could come from year 10, year 11. It could be something you're doing next week. And obviously, we've got a lot of guidance on our website as well about to help you with that process, and we'll be talking a bit more about that later. One more thing to note here is that the evidence needs to be consistent across a class or cohort wherever possible. So you can't just pick and choose random evidence for each student. You have to make sure it's consistent in approach. Obviously, there can be cases where you need to submit different evidence for a particular student. And there are examples given in the Joint Council guidance for that. So, for example, if a student was absent when a particular bit of content was taught, or they missed a particular assessment, it may be appropriate to substitute that with alternative evidence. And then you would need to record the reasons for that on the assessment record. Again, there's lots of guidance in the Joint Council guidance document about how to arrive at a grade. This slide sort of is a really sort of simplified overview of that process. But essentially, you need to consider what's been taught, because obviously you can only assess them on what you've been taught. You need to collect the evidence, and then you need to evaluate the quality of the evidence. So things like the nature of the evidence, how and when it was produced, under what conditions was it produced, was it supervised, was it non-supervised, when was it produced under lockdown. You need to establish whether the proposed range of evidence is suitable for all students. So again, there may have been students who were particularly affected by lockdown, and it may be appropriate to substitute alternative evidence for that student. And then you need to assign a grade, and that needs to be a holistic judgment across the range of evidence, considering the quality of the work in relation to the published grade descriptors and the exemplification. So this is not a mathematical formula or calculation. And then obviously the window for submitting your grades is the 26th of May to the 18th of June. So we just mentioned briefly that using that holistic judgment needs to be made based on grade descriptors and published exemplification. So on our website, you can find grade descriptors for GCSE history, AS history, and A-level history. And they were written through the Joint Council. So that, as I said, they're the same for AQA and OCR for history. They describe mid-grade performance, which means the middle of each grade. For A-level, there are grade descriptors for grades A, C, and E, and there are also characteristics at the A-B borderline. AS is only A, C, and E, and for GCSE, the grade descriptors are for 8, 6, 5, 4, and 2. They're based on the original off-qual descriptors for 8, 5, and 2, which we use as a starting point for that. And I think the rationale for that when they were originally written was that they were sort of brand new grades, if you like, the 8 being sort of not a bit higher than the old A7 and the 5 being higher than the old 4C. So that's the rationale for that. Now, if you've downloaded the grade descriptors from our website, you'll notice that they don't include things like grade 9, grade 3 at GCSE. They don't include the grade A star or A level. Now, that's because we uploaded the original version that was sent to us by the Joint Council. They have since added sort of general descriptors for those grades, so for grade 9, grade A star. So that if you want a more up-to-date version which has got those on there, then get them from the Joint Council website. I believe that we are going to update ours soon as well. So as well as those grade descriptors, we've also got grade and exemplification for each specification, and they were made available on the 19th of April. So they're quite detailed. They go through lots of different scripts, examples of scripts, and they give you advice about the grade that the student received. And they're using actual scripts from the summer series. This slide talks about the use of data. And essentially, it's saying two things. So the first thing it's talking about is the use of tracking systems. So we understand that a lot of schools have and use tracking systems that provide sort of working at and target grades for students. And the general advice here is that you shouldn't be using these as a basis for your teacher assessed grades, because the grades need to be based on actual evidence, actual work that students have produced, and you shouldn't be essentially predicting a trajectory and saying that I think this student could potentially get a particular grade at the end of this process. The second thing it's talking about here is historical data, so your outcomes each year, if you like, on a particular subject. And it says that used appropriately, data on historical student and centre performance can help support the internal quality assurance process for assigning grades. The purpose of reviewing data on past performance is not to attempt to determine a student or a centre's outcomes this summer, but as one source of evidence from the examination series which operated as normal that can inform teachers' professional judgments on the level of attainment achieved by their students. So essentially, what we're saying here is that we recommend that you do consider historical data when you're considering the outcomes for this year's cohort. But really, that's just to sort of ensure that you're broadly in line with the type of results that you would expect year on year. Now, obviously, we're not expecting you to sort of have exactly the same outcomes every year. We know that results, can vary each year, but it's just something that you need to consider as part of your quality assurance process. And if you read the last bit here, it says that centres should be aware of the distribution of grades awarded to students in previous June series. However, grade and judgments should not be driven by this data. Historical grades should only be considered after grade and judgments have been made. So what we don't want you to do is think, well, we usually get 1 or 2 grade 9s and we get about 5 grade 7s. So let's have 2 grade 9s and 5 grade 7s. Who are we going to give it to? That's not the approach you need to be taking. The approach you need to be taking is to sort of use holistic judgments based on the quality of the evidence to arrive at your grades, and then reflect on that by considering your historical performance. Just a quick word about the additional assessment materials. So they went on our website earlier. Now they are basically collections of past paper questions. They're padlocked on our website, and they contain the mark schemes as well. And they were released on the 31st of March. And on the 12th of April, we also released the grading exemplification documents and some further support and guidance. Now, as well as this information, and I'll show you where it is on the website a bit later on, don't forget that there is already a lot of guidance and support on our website to help you with marking. So there is things like training, past training content, there are pre-recorded events, there's exemplification, there's the examiner's report. So don't forget, don't just over-rely on the stuff that we're producing now. There is already a lot of material available. So these materials were sort of produced in line with the Joint Council. We all had to follow a similar approach, all the exam boards, all the subjects. And these materials exist for every subject, essentially. And it's just past paper questions and mark schemes under padlock. We also released a student version as well, minus the mark schemes. And the minimum requirement for those was that they covered 3 series worth of examination material. Just a quick word about adjustments, reasonable adjustments. So if you've got students who have special requirements, then the advice is that you still apply for special consideration this year through the normal process, through your exams officer. That's just to formalise any arrangements that you've got in place for students' assessments this year. Also, if you've got students who require modified papers, so things in enlarged print like sources and things like that, we do have modified papers on our website already in the past papers section, but they may not exist for what you want. So if you need something for a particular question paper, then just apply through the normal process again through the exams officer for enlarged print and things like that. And then moving on to the appeals process, this is also covered in the Joint Council guidance, and we're going to have our own section on our website, which has got a lot of detail on that soon. Essentially, the aim of the whole process is to ensure that on results days, students are issued with fair and consistent grades that have been objectively reached. It's really important that you share information with students about the evidence that you're using as part of your grading process. So you can tell them what sort of evidence is going to be used. You can give them information about the marks they've achieved. What you can't tell them is the grades that you're going to give them. Now, obviously, on results day, we hope that everyone's happy with their results and they get the results that they feel they deserve. But if they're not happy with their results, then students will be able to appeal that grade. So the first thing they can do is they can ask the centre to check whether there's been an administration error or a procedural error when assigning the grade. And if you check that and you find that that has happened, then you can contact us and submit a revised grade and provide a rationale for that. And if we feel that that's a viable rationale, then we'll issue a revised grade. If you don't think that an error has been made, then the student can then ask you to appeal to us on their behalf. And then you need to submit an appeal on the student's behalf, providing evidence on which the judgment was made about their grade. And we'll consider that and whether that grade reflects an appropriate exercise of academic judgment. And if we think it isn't, then we'll determine the grades that the evidence would support. And at that point, we'll also be checking that you followed your own centre process. So that's where it's really important that you make sure you're in line with that. Okay, so that's a sort of overview of the general process and guidance that the JCQ have. We're now going to move on to the next section, which is about the support we've got in place on our website. So this slide is really about this new part of our site called the Pearson Professional Development Academy. Now you can access this through the main website if you go to the 2021 support button, and there's a link to it in there. And on this site, we're uploading lots of guidance for this whole process. So there's guides, videos, pre-recorded videos, live events, lots and lots of things like checklists. So just on the screen, you can see some examples of some of the guidance that's available. So it's definitely worth going on to that and having a look through the stuff that's available. On that site, you can also sign up. So if there's new training events becoming available, we'll let you know as well. There's a link on here to the Summer 21 support page. This is kind of like the main hub on our website where new information is made available, new guidance. It's really useful page. It's really worth just checking it regularly. Obviously, there's also information on Ofqual's website and, as I mentioned earlier, the Joint Council's website. So if you go to the Joint Council's website and then click the Summer 21 menu option, there's just a ton of stuff on there. You can also sign up for regular bulletins, qualification bulletins, which we're sending out every couple of weeks, and you can read the old bulletins as well. So please check that out on our website. Just a quick reminder about the MOCS marking service. So this is a paid-for service that we've got in place where you can get your students to sit past papers, and then we'll mark it, and you can do sort of analysis like Results Plus and stuff like that. Obviously, the deadline for Year 11 and Year 13 students is now closed, but it is still possible to register your Year 10 and Year 12 students on this service. And there's more information and guidance available for you should you think you might be interested in that for next year. Now, we do obviously understand that this is a really stressful time for students and parents and carers. My own son's gone through this process at the moment, and I kind of really do appreciate how sort of stressful it is. So we do have a lot of support in place for students and parents. We've got a web page, there's videos and letters and timelines and infographics, and they can also sign up for a newsletter, and they can also give us ask questions as well if they need help or support through a feedback form. So there's various links on here if you want to take advantage of it or point your students in that direction. Okay, so that's the end of the sort of general stuff. We're now going to move on to the FAQs that I've written for. As I said, it's basically just reflecting on all the questions that I'm getting from history teachers and try to sort of address them in FAQs. So the first set of FAQs are about the evidence, the type of evidence and things like that. And the first question is, how many pieces of evidence do we have to submit? Is there a minimum? So the official answer here is that there is no official requirement for how many pieces of evidence centres need to submit. It really does depend on the type of evidence used. So for example, was it a full past paper done under controlled conditions, or is it just an essay that was done for homework? You need to consider the amount of assessment students would normally undertake in the summer exam series, and try to ensure where possible there are examples of assessment across each of the topics taught and the different range of assessment objectives. Obviously, if you've got circumstances which make that not possible, then that's fine, but that's the sort of ideal position. A-level history teachers should include the coursework or NEA in the evidence unless there was significant disruption which prevented it from being written. And again, just please do consult your centre's policy on the teacher assessed grades for further guidance on the amount of evidence required. Now, there's a really useful document on the Joint Council website called, it's basically called Guidance on Worked Examples, and I've put a link to it in this presentation. This goes through a number of scenarios where different students, fake students and the type of evidence that's been used. And I really recommend that you have a look at that as a guide to the sort of type of evidence that you might want to use and the number of evidence. So it's really useful document, that. The next question about evidence is there a minimum requirement of content that needs to have been taught to submit a teacher assessed grade? So for example, some teachers haven't finished teaching paper 3, or they never got around to teaching the historic environment because they were doing it during the first lockdown. So the official answer here is there's no set requirement for the minimum amount of content that students must have been taught. The head of centre will need to confirm and sign that the students have been taught sufficient content to form the basis for a grade and progress to the next level of study. Now, the sort of caveat to that is that there is an expectation that centres continue to teach the specification content for as long as possible this year. So it may be appropriate to assess students on some of this content. So if you haven't finished teaching paper 3 and you haven't assessed it yet, you may feel it's appropriate to keep teaching some of that and assess the students on that. But that would very much depend on your circumstances in your centre, how badly you've been affected, whether there's other parts of the specification that you need to teach and assess, things like that. The next question is, do we need to provide evidence from all the topics taught? And by that I mean the 3 topics, not 4. So ideally, yes, we'd like to see evidence from across the range of topics and AOs taught. Sorry, that was for GCSE history, by the way. Now, there is an expectation that centres continue to teach and assess students for as long as possible. So as I said, it may be appropriate to revisit the teaching of part of a topic that wasn't taught properly the first time around. And if you did that, you might decide that it wasn't appropriate to give students a complete past paper on that. So it might just be something that's focused on a particular part of the content that you've managed to cover, or a particular assessment like the narrative account question or something like that in GCSE. But again, this very much depends on the individual circumstances of your centre, how much evidence you already have, and whether you and your head of centre feel they've already covered sufficient course content. The official guidance from Ofqual and the Joint Council is that it's not necessary for every aspect of the specification to be assessed to arrive at a grade. And obviously, you know, if you can't assess certain question types, you may be able to provide evidence from other parts of the course which have that similar question type. So again, at GCSE, an example might be the source utility question, which comes up in paper 1 and paper 3. That's just one example. The next evidence question: do we need to get students to complete all types of questions on a paper? Can we remove certain questions on a paper or swap them for others? So, you know, ideally, we'd like to see evidence of all the question types being assessed, but again, it depends on the situation within your centre and how much the teaching was affected. We've already said that the evidence for the tags doesn't have to be based on a complete question paper. So, for example, you may feel it's appropriate to shorten a paper by removing a question in order that the students can attempt that in your normal class time. As I've said, some question types can be found on different papers, so you could demonstrate evidence of assessment on different papers if necessary. And really, you just need to use your professional judgment on this in consultation with your centre's policy on grading to decide whether you feel that the grades are based on a suitable range of evidence. And in doing so, try and reflect upon the range of content and assessment that the students would normally be expected to have sat in the summer 2021 exam series had the exams gone ahead. Now, we know in history we sometimes have obviously GCSE we have multiple classes. A-level we actually have classes doing different topics altogether. So this question is about whether, if you've got two classes studying different topics, and this is about GCSE and different abilities, does all the evidence have to be the same across both classes? And the answer here is ideally yes, certainly if they're doing the same topics. You know, for most students, it's really important that the evidence used is consistent and a differentiated approach is not warranted. Obviously, if you've got multiple teachers, multiple classes, it's really important that you carry out internal standardization of the marking, the standards, and also make sure the assessments that you're running are kind of standardized across different classes as well, so that students have a similar experience, if you like, just to make it fair. Obviously, if you are studying different topics, so you might have a group doing the Cold War at GCSE and a group doing American West, or A-level, you might have an early modern route and a medieval route, then clearly, you know, you can't submit identical evidence where there are differences in topics. But, you know, try for some consistency there. So, you know, if you're submitting a whole past paper for one group, then try and submit a whole past paper for the other group, if that makes sense. We do have a few GCSE centres who've taught all 4 topics. Not many, but I know there are some out there. I think some of them had already taught like Nazi Germany in year 10. So basically, the choice they got was you have to do it all, basically. And in those instances, if you want to submit evidence from all 4 topics, then you're welcome to, but you don't have to. Again, it may be worth reflecting on the conditions in which those topics were taught. So were they taught during the first lockdown where lots of students were not getting sort of high quality online teaching, or they didn't have internet access and things like that? So that's something that you need to use your judgment on. But for the majority of GCSE centres, we are only expecting the evidence from the 3 main topics taught. Our students did a mock test in year 10. We have their marks but no longer have their work. Can we still use this as evidence? Now, this is actually really important. The guidance states that if the student's work is not available, then you can still use the marks as evidence to determine the final grade, but you also need the actual test to submit alongside it. So if they sat the summer 18 paper as a mock in year 10 and you've just not got any of their work, or they took it home with them and you know they can't find it, then it's, for those students, it's fine. As long as you've got the mark and you've got the test it was based on, you can use that as evidence. Now we're going to move on to the additional assessment materials now. One of the burning questions that we were being asked a lot earlier this month is, why do they only contain past paper questions? So why have you not given us a brand new question paper? Now, as I've already stated, our approach had to be in line with all the other exam boards, and we were kind of following the official approach set out by Ofqual. And I think really it was felt that by using existing past paper questions, that was the best and most consistent way to support you in this process of marking and grading, because we already know a lot about those questions and how they perform. We've got grade boundaries, results plus data. You know how they perform because you presumably taught them to your students, so you've got experience of marking them. You know, there's a lot that we know about them. If you think about brand new questions, apart from the fact that they take a long time to produce, so you know we would have been up against it to get them out in time. Basically, we have no experience of seeing those perform in an exam, so we could have a really challenging question or question paper, and you know it could cause quite a lot of issues when it comes to you using them to assess students. So that was the general principle behind why we only using past papers for UK qualifications. So I'm getting some questions from teachers who are saying, basically, we've used all the past papers. What would you suggest we do now then? Now, obviously, you know, the evidence can come from throughout the taught course. So if you've used every single past paper, sample paper, specimen paper, then you may already have enough evidence for your students. You know, if you think you need more, say, for example, the work was done in year 10 or even in year 9, and you think, you know, they might not have been mature enough and it might not be sort of reflecting the sort of standard that they're currently working at, then, you know, you need to decide how appropriate it is to use some of that material again. Now, you know, this is not a high stakes assessment where the students haven't seen questions before. You know, it's understood that they may have seen some of that material previously. The purpose of any materials you use need to be considered before they're included in a range of evidence. So you know, if you gave them a test like a past paper last week, you know, you need to ask yourself if it's appropriate to do that same test again next week, or clearly it isn't. But if you did that test in year 9 or earlier in year 10, you know, you might feel it's more appropriate to either reuse some of that content. And don't forget, you know, you can create your own papers. You can take questions from our papers. You can use questions from books, third-party sources. There's lots of textbooks for our course. You can create your own questions, so you can alter a question so to turn it into a different type of question. This is up to you, basically, how you use that material. Now we're going to move on to the grading side of things, and I'm getting a lot of questions about grading, grade boundaries, what standard are we using this year? So the official guidance states that you should make it no easier or harder for a student to achieve a particular grade this year compared to previous years. So this is the same advice that was given last year, and the expected performance for a grade has not changed. Now, the advice here in terms of your quality assurance process is to consider the grades for this year's cohort compared to the performance when exams actually took place. So series which were not affected by COVID. So essentially it's summer 2018, summer 2019, where you can be confident that a consistent national standard was applied. So if you're reflecting, for example, on your historical performance when you're looking at your outcomes of your grading outcomes to see whether it's sort of broadly in line or a kind of reasonable expectation, don't look at summer 20, look at summer 18 and 19 outcomes. And it should be noted that the November 20 exam series was not a typical cohort in this regard. So it was a very, very small cohort. It was not typical in terms of the range of students that sat the exams, and the awarding outcomes were not in line with 2018 or 19. They were in line with the summer 20 outcomes. So it wasn't a normal year, basically, that year. So then the next question is, what grade boundaries should we use, and can we use those November 20 grade boundaries? So if you look at the Joint Council guidance, all the advice suggests that you take a holistic approach to grading in combination with the grade descriptors that are published and the detailed grading exemplification. if you look at the worked example document that's on the Joint Council website, you'll see that there are lots of examples where there is no grade applied to a particular assessment. It's perfectly fine to consider the mark itself alongside other pieces of evidence. If your evidence is based on a past paper, a complete past paper, where there is a published notional paper grade boundary, then you can use those grade boundaries to help give you confidence in the grade that's been assigned. But as I said, you need to be really careful about using the November 20 boundaries because it was not a typical exam series. So try and use grade boundaries where there's been a sort of consistent national standard applied. So 2017 for A-level, 2018-19 for GCSE. Now, this is a GCSE specific question. We're getting a lot of questions from teachers about the weighting of papers now that you've dropped one of the topics, and how you sort of add up grade boundaries and things like that. So on the screen, there are two alternative weightings depending on which paper was dropped this summer for GCSE. So the top example is where students study paper 1, paper 3 and 1 paper 2 topic. And as you can see, paper 1 is 38%, paper 2 24%, paper 3 38%. The bottom example is where a student has not sat paper 1, so they've done paper 3 in both paper 2 topics. Now, when you're thinking about how marks add up to the overall qualification mark, and you've dropped a topic, how you're going to do that, basically, there is no scaling in our GCSE history specification, so the marks simply add up on a one-to-one basis on each paper. So, for example, we take the student's mark on paper 1, paper 2, paper 3, add it up, that's their total mark. You don't need to apply any scaling factors at all. Now, if you look at the notional paper boundaries document, which is their grade boundaries for each paper in the spec, the grades at the key judgmental boundaries, they're the boundaries that the examiners actually decide on considering the quality of work and statistical analysis, and they come up with a mark and they say, right, this mark is the grade 7. Those grade boundaries add up. So if you take the grade 7 boundary for paper 1, paper 2, paper 3 for your route, it will add up to the paper 7 overall boundary. The same will apply to the grade 4 and the grade 1. Now, the grades in between, the 6, the 3, and the 2, they are not set judgmentally. So the examiners don't look at the scripts and go, oh, that could be a 6. They're literally set mathematically. So the 6 is literally a third of the way between the 7 and the 4, if that makes sense. That's how it works, basically. Now, because you can't have, sometimes the marks, they're like half a mark, so you can't have a grade boundary which is half a mark. So basically, when you try and add those up for the total boundary, they might not add up exactly overall. They might be a couple of marks out. But if you just need some, like a rough boundary for a kind of, a grading decision, it's perfectly fine to sort of add them up like that. Or obviously you can just consider them at paper level using the notional boundaries. Another thing to consider with GCSE paper 2 is that the notional paper boundaries cover both the British depth study and the period study. So there is not a single boundary for Elizabeth. There's a boundary for Elizabeth and the Cold War. There's a boundary for American West and Richard and John, but there is not a boundary for Richard and John. So if your students have dropped one of those papers and you need to try and work out a rough boundary, then you can convert those boundaries into sort of percentages and apply them to a mark, or you can divide it by 2. But obviously that's really rough because it doesn't work out like that. It isn't precisely always going to be 50-50. For example, say you've got Henry VIII, it might be quite a challenging paper, so the boundaries will reflect that in the overall weighting. But really, if you just want a kind of a rough idea of grading on paper 2, that's all you can do basically. So hopefully you can see when we're talking about this, there's quite a lot of rough estimation going on here, and for that reason we do advise some caution when using grade boundaries. Use them as a guide where they exist for a particular exam series, but it really is important that you don't just over rely on them and feel straitjacketed by them and kind of come up with your own boundaries and kind of use that as a basis for grading. You know, the instruction is clear from the Joint Council that you should be making holistic judgments based on the quality of the work, in relation to the descriptors, the exemplification, and yes, if boundaries exist, use them to give you confidence in your judgments, basically. For GCSE, we've also got SPAG, spelling, punctuation, and grammar. Now, that was being removed from paper 1 when the exams were going ahead, but obviously that's not the case now, so SPAG still is in paper 1. It's only kind of 4 marks in the 16-mark questions in those papers, and SPAG isn't included in the sort of general grade descriptors, the generic grade descriptors. So there isn't really any official advice on how you deal with SPAG. So our advice is that, you know, if you've got students who might be borderline students, then it may be worth revisiting the mark scheme for those relevant questions to consider how those elements might affect the overall grade. And another question here about how do I account for a student who's improved their grades from year 10 to year 11? Can you still use the year 10 mock but award a higher grade? And the answer to that is yes. If a student shows improvement over the course, so for example, they were producing grade 5 level work in year 10 and grade 6 in year 11, then the student can be awarded a grade 6. You just need to make clear the rationale for that on your assessment record, and use the Joint Council template for that. Now, again, in the worked examples document that I referred to earlier on the Joint Council website, there's an example of that in there. So how do you reach a holistic judgment using the grade descriptors? Obviously, it's quite a complicated process. I've tried to sort of simplify it here and break it down into a number of steps. Essentially, you need to assign a grade for every student by considering the quality of work in relation to the grade descriptors and the grade exemplification. Where evidence is based on a past paper with published boundaries, then these can be used to help give you confidence that the grade that's been assigned. If you find that evidence covers more than one grade descriptor, then a best fit approach could be used in order to make a holistic judgment on the grade. So, for example, if you're looking at a portfolio of evidence for the student and it's displaying many characteristics of a grade 6, some characteristics of a grade 5, and a single characteristic of grade 4, then clearly a grade 5 or 6 would be appropriate. And since there are more grade 6 characteristics, then you may decide that grade 6 is appropriate. But obviously, you might want to consider the sort of nature of the evidence and the sort of when it was produced and things like that as well as part of your consideration. So, for example, was that were the grade 5s mainly produced in year 10 and the grade 6 in year 11, things like that. I just want to talk quickly about A-level history coursework. This for the A-level teachers. We're getting quite a few questions on that. So I apologize now for I don't think we've made it clear enough on our website that the moderation process isn't going ahead this year. I hope you have picked that up. It was mentioned in some bulletins, but unfortunately we'd introduced a new like online process just before the announcement, and so there was quite a few notes on the website about it, and I think people still expected that to go ahead. So the answer here is no, we will not be formally moderating your coursework this year. Obviously, you can still use the coursework to inform your teacher assessed grade, so it can be evidence. Do students still need to complete the resource record sheets? I think we'd like them to, yes, because the purpose of those sheets is to validate and document their inquiry process. So really, in order to explain to you how they've done that and prove that they have actually done the work, it would be helpful to submit those resource record sheets. And again, with the authentication sheets, yes, we think that it's important that they still sign those off, because they're basically telling you that this is their own work. They haven't just downloaded it off the internet. Would students still be penalised for going over the word limit? So the word limit for A-level coursework is 4,000 words, and students are allowed to go over this already by 10%, circa 10%. Now, if they have gone over this, then we suggest that you give it back to them and ask them to edit it down. But if they don't, then you do still need to apply the mark scheme. You can't change the mark scheme. So basically, it just prevents them from getting the top mark band in the level that they're sitting in based on the qualities that they've displayed, essentially. There is a guidance document on the A-level history qualification page about that, or I can email you if you need it. Should we tell students their coursework marks this year? This is a really interesting question, because a few years ago, the Joint Council made it really clear that you must tell students their coursework marks and provide them with an opportunity to appeal that mark. And honestly, I don't think, unless I haven't checked recently, but going back a week or so ago, there was not an official answer on this coming out of the JCQ. But what we think is appropriate here is that, part of the guidance is that you must ensure that students are aware of the evidence used to determine their grade. So you may share results associated with individual pieces of evidence, but you must not share the grade submitted. So we think, therefore, that in line with that, it's appropriate to tell students the marks for their coursework, basically. This is quite a complicated one, really. I've tried to simplify it, but basically, what happens if your students didn't finish their coursework? Do you still have to mark it and submit it as evidence? So the official guidance here is that, they should continue with their coursework where possible, if it's safe. The normal 15th of May deadline doesn't apply this year, so potentially they've got till June. So if they can continue with it and you feel it's appropriate, then try and get them to finish it. But they should not be penalized if they haven't been able to complete it due to circumstances beyond their control. So that's really up to you. That's your judgment call. If students submit coursework that's not complete or it's been affected by the lockdown, then the advice here is that you need to mark it using the mark scheme, but that you should balance their performance in the coursework where it's not complete with other sources of evidence. So, look for other evidence as part of the course where they might have demonstrated similar skills. So, for example, the interpretations part of paper 1, and kind of try and balance that when you're making your final grading decisions for the students. So, if their mark on coursework is quite low and it's not their fault because of lockdown, then you don't have to that doesn't have to bring their overall grade down. Essentially, that's what we're saying. You just need to record the rationale for those decisions and how much weight you've applied to that coursework in your evidence as part of your grading decision, your assessment record. Okay, so that's the end of the FAQs. We've just got a quick section on the support that's available that's history specific on our website. Now, basically, there's a lot of history support on the qualification page. So you go to qualifications, then GCSE or A-level history, and then select course materials. And then on the little drop down on the left-hand side, you can see we've highlighted teaching and learning materials. Now, on there, you can see there's exemplar student material, there's guidance, past training content. So all of that stuff could be useful to help you mark. There's lots of exemplars from each exam series in there. And at the bottom of that screen, you can just see a tab that says Summer 21 Assessment Materials for Centres. Now, that's the section where you can get the grading exemplification, the mapping grids, the assessment materials, all that stuff's on there, basically. We've also got on-demand training. So if you go to the support, then training, and then rather than searching for live training, click on-demand training, and then search for GCSE or A-level history, and you'll find some pre-recorded feedback events which sort of methodically go through the marking of exemplars from summer 19. So again, if you want help with marking or standardizing marking, that stuff's really useful. just a quick summary of the materials that are on those pages. So for GCSE history, the exemplars, there's student answers with comments from 2018, 2019. There's paper guides for each paper, results plus data, so it shows like mean marks for each question type at different grade points. There is past training materials, so there's lots of training for different question types, so the utility questions, things like that. Feedback on past exam series. There's the summer 21 materials I've already talked about, the grade descriptors, etc. And there's also a guide for creating exam wizard topic checks. So don't forget, you can also use our exam wizard to create papers as well using the past paper questions. So you just need an Edexcel Online login for that. And again, really just a similar amount of support for A-level, really, same sort of things. So exemplars from different exam series, results plus data, training materials, things like that. And again, pre-recorded training. Okay, so the last slide now, we're almost getting to the end, 3 minutes to go. It's just a summary of the past papers and sample papers that are available on our website for GCSE and A-level history. So essentially there are 5 official question papers for GCSE, and there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 6 for A-level, 7 for AS history. So quite a lot of papers, and obviously, as I said, you can mix them up if you need to. You can create your own as well. So a lot, I appreciate, I do understand that some teachers wanted brand new questions, but hopefully, there's enough there if you also factor in things like you're able to sort of mix them up or write your own and things like that. Right, so that's the end of the slides. I hope you found that useful. I think I'm going to check the question and answer box now, because I suspect that there's been a lot of questions that have come in that maybe Mark and Sarah couldn't answer because there wasn't time. We'll try and go through some of these questions after the event as well, if we can't get back to you. But also, you're welcome to just email me at teachinghistory@pearson.com, and I'll get back to you quickly if you need advice. That's fine. Or I can call you as well if you need to talk things through. If anyone has any specific questions they want to enter via the group chat, I think we could try for the next minute or so. It's up to you if you've got anything that you think needs answering. I can see in the group chat there's a question from Robert J. Are we going to be asked to submit evidence of topics taught as well as the actual physical assessments that we're using? So I don't think so. No, it's really just the evidence needs to reflect an appropriate amount of content that's been taught. But obviously, that there may be cases where you couldn't teach the content, and that's obviously going to be very different for different centres. I think if you've got, your centre's policy on grading should kind of cover, what your approach is going to be if there were topics that were really badly affected, and also if you've got concerns like you want to explain why you haven't got a full past paper for a particular topic, you could just write in the a sort of rationale for that in the assessment record as well. Someone's asked if the session will be available to watch again after today. You'll be emailed a copy of a recording of the event. Literally, it should come, I think, half an hour after the event. But I believe we're also going to try and put a copy on the website as well, basically. Someone's asked if we can add SPAG retrospectively. I mean, as I said, when it's up to you. You've got your students to sit a paper, presumably it was a paper 1, you know, if you feel it's appropriate to go back and remark that and reward them for SPAG, that's fine. As I said, the grade descriptors, they don't include SPAG, so it's not essential. But if you think it might benefit or help with some borderline students, then that might be appropriate, yes. Someone's asked how much are students allowed to resit individual assignments after the 25th of May deadline? I'm not sure what you mean by that exactly, but essentially, if you mean like kind of give them a test and then give them another, just repeat that test, I think, you know, there is a bit of guidance in that joint council about that you need to use your own judgment on what you feel is appropriate, and you need to reflect upon whether it's actually beneficial to get students to just to be doing another assignment, because, you know, they're not just sitting history, they're sitting like loads of subjects, especially GCSE students, and they've got, you know, like I know, you know, as I say, my son's doing it at the moment, and there are tests coming thick and fast every day, multiple tests. You know, is that fair on the students to get them to sit another test? You know, and then also you've got to reflect upon whether you feel it's appropriate if they've used those questions in the past. How long ago was it? What were the circumstances that they did those under? Would it be more appropriate if I sort of mix it up a bit or gave them a different test, essentially? Is every school going to be sampled, asked for evidence? Yes, apparently that is the announcement that came out from Ofqual. It's on an Ofqual blog on their website. They announced it sort of late last week that every school would have to provide evidence. As I said, the minimum will be 1 A-level subject for 5 students, and 2 GCSE subjects, which will be 5 students, and one of those subjects will be English or maths. And we will tell you what subjects and students we want to see, and then you need to send it within 40 hours, basically. That's the process that they've sort of outlined. So someone's asking if you've got a cohort of 70 kids, would you have to submit all of them? So my understanding, as I said, there's not a lot of information available at the moment. It's kind of coming through Ofqual. So far it looks like there'll be kind of 5 students initially, but if we're not happy with that, if we've got concerns, we might ask to see them all or more of them. If concerns are raised through the quality assurance process, so stage 2, when we're having sort of virtual visits and we've given you feedback on your policy, it may be that we could ask for more. I guess if concerns are raised about the grades awarded, like say they're you know, incredibly generous and that's not typical for your centre, there may be it may be appropriate to ask for more evidence. So it'll depend on that, basically. Will evidence be uploaded digitally? I think so. Again, I don't know how it's going to work, but everything seems to be working digitally through portals like Edexcel Online and EAQA and OCR's version, so yes. Can we mix and match mock papers from across both years? Do they have to be the same for all students? But, really, you know, if you follow the guidance, it has to be consistent for all students. So if you're using a mock from year 10, you know, you should be using that mock for all students. And that doesn't mean you know that you know, in year 10 some students might not have performed very well on that mock, but they may have improved in year 11. So it's not, you don't have to look at that and go, oh, you know, gosh, I can't use that because that kid didn't get an A and he's working at an A now. You know, you've got to use your judgment on that, but you can't just pick and choose that mock for that kid and that mock for that kid. There's got to be a kind of more consistent approach, unless there's a valid reason. So let's say one student was absent, they didn't have internet access, they weren't attending lessons when, you know, in lockdown. It may be appropriate for that student to use a different form of assessment, and you just put that rationale in your assessment record. Someone's asking to what extent class discussion can form part of the holistic judgment. I think what I think you're asking is, basically the evidence needs to be based on the type of work that students will be expected to produce in an exam. So essentially questions that look like or are our exam questions. So at GCSE, a narrative question, an essay that's 60 marks with a judgment, a source utility question. That's the sort of thing you need to be basing your evidence on. So, things like class discussions, debates, things like that. I get that you can, it can sort of form a judgment, but really that's not in line with the type of evidence that we need. It really does need to be in the sort of form that our exam questions are in, basically. So we're assessing them against second order concepts, using our mark schemes for consistency, basically. Jennifer's asking, what if students want to improve their own range of evidence? We've tried to put some onus on students to be responsible for what is in their evidence folder. Now, my initial feelings are that is not really in line with the Joint Council guidance, which states that the evidence needs to be consistent across the whole class or cohort. But if you think you want to do that approach, you need to discuss that with your SLT and make sure that there's a valid rationale for that, and that it's in your clearly spelled out in your centre policy, and that centre policy will be reviewed. But my instinct there is you can't do that, really. It has to be a consistent approach, and the teacher should be making decisions on what evidence will count. It may be appropriate to consider classwork, that's fine, but again, it needs to be the teacher. Okay, so yeah, you've been advised by the SLT. So, essentially your SLT are making their own interpretation of that guidance. They will outline clearly their policy for setting grades in their policy document, which will be sent, submitted at the end of this month, and then that will be reviewed by someone. And that's that sort of thing. If that's the approach they want to take, then I can't challenge that. That'll be sort of picked up by the people and looked at and discussed with them as part of virtual visits if it's felt appropriate, essentially. Basically, you do need to follow what the process that's outlined by your SLT in their policy, basically. Okay, I'm just scrolling through the group chat, and I think that looks like the end of the questions coming in. So basically, as I said, we'll try and answer some of the questions that haven't been answered already through the Q&A. But if for some reason we don't get back to you, please just email me at teachinghistory@pearson.com, and I'll get back to you straight away. Thank you very much for attending today. I hope you found it useful. But I'd welcome your feedback as well. Please feel free to contact me.